Have you ever woken up and chosen suffering? Because I sure have. That's why I decided to beat Factorio with only a mouse. Not that kind of mouse. And before you ask, no, I'm not allowed to rebind any of the controls. If I did, I would just grab a mouse like this and be done with it. So yeah, I'm going to be using entirely default keybinds. And without a keyboard, I had trouble even finding a map, despite having a single requirement: spawning on an iron patch. And every failed map required me to readjust all the sliders, re-roll, and wait for a now unskippable cutscene to slowly pan. The game did give a pretty generous map preview, but eyeing the exact center down to a few pixels wasn't so easy, so I got stuck like this a lot. Thankfully, the game runs in windowed mode, so I can right-click the taskbar and close the game that way. No keyboard required. After a few failed attempts, I gave in and opened the ultra secret options menu. By Control-Alt-clicking the settings menu, you can access this hidden menu that lets you change the map preview size. I did need a keyboard for this, but it's technically before the game starts. That's fair game, at least by speedrun rules. The only downside of the limited map preview is that I couldn't see much of the map, so I had to hope it was good. With that out of the way, I finally spawn on Ironed, and there's a dialogue box. Well, that's it. That's the run. GG. Just kidding. I accidentally clicked single player. This box does not appear in multiplayer, so I restarted the game, did the whole shebang, and bam, directly on an iron patch. Speaking of, why is it so important that I spawn on iron anyway? Well, without mods, Factorio doesn't have point-and-click movement options, and we're going full vanilla. That means my character is lazy and refuses to walk even a single step, because that would require a keyboard. Instead, I have to use the most popular transport tool in the game, the Humble Belt. I'll be using it to transport myself as well as items at a blazing 1.9 tiles per second. For reference, that's about 1/4 of the default movement speed. There's a saving grace though. The crashed ship has just enough iron to build a belt and get out of here. It is a bit out of reach, so I do need to go with another option. There's also one wood and a furnace, which can smelt just enough iron to get us a belt, so long as I got lucky and spawned an iron. It didn't hurt that I had turned the sliders all the way up, so I didn't need to get that lucky. Out of curiosity, I ran a script that scans map seeds for iron within a 3-tile radius of spawn. About 1 in 100 are technically playable with default map gen, assuming I can find the center, but maxing out the sliders bumps this up 15-fold. Definitely worth it. Now I just had to mine some iron and burn my precious wood to craft that essential belt. The wood actually burned long enough to craft 2 sets of belts, so I got a bit more iron before heading out. Now that I can move, it's normal Factorio. You smelt some iron, grab the furnace, inch over to the nearby forest, forget the furnace, go back, and repeat, before realizing the so-called forest won't even qualify as a Christmas tree lot. You know, typical Factorio. In no time at all, I had cleared the trees and made my way to the coal patch. I did notice an even better spot where all 4 resources met, so this entire trip was a bit of a waste, but it was still good practice. It was a bit slow to move with only a few belts, but it was surprisingly hard to place them as fast as I moved. This got a whole lot easier when I had some spare belt and could do longer stretches at a time. After making my way to the actually good spot, I crafted a few miners, built a moving walkway, and stayed there forever, fulfilling my dream of living in an airport luggage retrieval. It felt really slow to make a full loop anytime I needed something, but it took so long to feed everything that I found myself moving too fast to keep things fed. Crazy, right? It felt especially odd since Burner City should be the quickest part of the run. You have hotkeys to feed rows of furnaces in a single swipe and can instantly move stacks at a time. So yeah, I was already missing the keyboard. After a couple more expansions, I prepared to head east and... Wait, I haven't explained how I've been changing directions, have I? This is what made the run truly tedious. No walking honestly wasn't that bad, but this wasn't just no walking. This is no keyboard at all. And since the default orientation for everything is north, how was I rotating things? Well, the thing that makes this all possible is the snapping rotation of offshore pumps. By selecting offshore pumps and pretending to place them near the water, it will rotate that pump away from the shore. This rotation is then stored. So long as you clear your cursor without rotating again, that rotation will apply to the next thing you place. As a backup, rails can be used in a very similar way. It's a bit more effort because you need to place a curved rail and then use a train stop the same way you use the offshore pump, which isn't ideal, but it's better than getting stranded outside of water vision. With that cleared up, I collected as much iron as I could and crafted enough for a small power plant. It took a while to handcraft all of this, but the wait gave me some time to relax and stretch my hands. Well, hand. My other hand was busy, So anyway, power. I made a quick stop to set up coal mining and then headed north to set up boilers. Despite waiting so long for iron, I still didn't bring enough. This left me with too little pipe to connect the original plant, so I had to tear it down and build it a little bit to the right. Oh, I also couldn't reach both sides of the plants at once because of where I was standing, so I opted to just go through the power plant instead, which didn't end up mattering because I couldn't afford to make the whole plant, but it was something I needed to be aware of for future designs. The side of the belt really does matter. So I finished setting up whatever I could and rode that coal belt all the way back. With power online, I threw a research lab down and waited a couple short minutes to finish automation, which gave me a bit of time to start the smelting lane, and it didn't help that in typical anti-fashion, I forgot the power poles. Thankfully, chat was there to help out, but I clearly intended to not bring power, thank you very much, but I guess it's useful to have. Now for smelting and... oh, the research is already done. Oh well. I still need to set up smelting before I can do anything anyway. The mining for these were fairly straightforward, and they revealed just how helpful an unexpected hotkey was. Q picking, pipetting, whatever you want to call it. If you hover over an entity and press Q, it copies that entity and its direction into your cursor. I've always called it Q picking because that's the default keybind, but apparently it's bound to Q and mouse button 5. This meant that as long as a nearby entity had the right direction, I didn't need the offshore pump for every single rotation. I genuinely didn't know this going in, and I kid you not, probably saved an entire day of playtime. I mean, you saw how slow it was to rotate things. Now would be a good time to review some of the other things I can do without a keyboard, but first, there's something you can do without one. Like and subscribe, it really does help out a lot, and I'm only 100 subs from partnership, so I really appreciate it. So anyway, the Q pick button I was talking about. It can also be used to clear the cursor, which is useful for quickly grabbing from chests. The inventory can be opened by clicking on the player icon or a side mouse button, and the map can be accessed by clicking on the minimap and navigated by clicking and dragging. I also have access to all the main tools for controlling bots on the bottom menu. These include copy and paste, which I often use for setting recipes, and also creating blueprints, which I am allowed to use. However, I can only use ones I create within the run because I wanted the bot phase to be interesting. Anyway, this smelting lane was the first time I had regularly placed things in a ton of different directions, so you can imagine Q-pick helped a lot. You typically have 2 directions of inserters and 3 directions of belts for a total of 5 cardinal directions. Wait. Okay, fine. It's still only 3 directions, but I swap between them a lot. Once one lane was down, I had all the rotations I needed for future lanes, so they got a lot smoother. To start, I opted for a half lane of each metal so I could get automation up and running. Up until this point, I had been handcrafting every intermediate. Feeding things manually was just so slow that I couldn't justify personal assemblers. This was a bad call, since I still outpaced my crafting queue, even with just a mouse. No matter how slowly you play, this game really does urge you towards automation. Overall, the lanes went okay, but I made one big mistake, planning for steel furnaces. I built a half-length smelting array to reduce how long it took to get to the other side, and what a terrible idea. Turns out, most of my time was spent in the base itself, not crossing smelters, so dealing with awkward half-lanes was a headache. I didn't even upgrade them for 4 hours, so it really was not worth it. It was also around this time that a new chatter came in and asked the most devastating question to date. They wanted to know if this was my first time playing Factorio. It still haunts me to this day. Once I recovered from that brutal blow and got smelting up and running, I was only a few awkward rotations away from the first automation, a belt assembler. It didn't help me move faster per se, because I could already delete things as fast as I move, but having that excess to leave behind simplifies things. Sure, I might have to delete it later, but that's future Anti's problem. Present Anti was enjoying the freedom of littering. I also used up the last of my power poles here, so I took a quick trip to clear another forest and... okay, it wasn't quick, and I didn't clear the forest, and honestly, it was barely even a forest. I really just settled for whatever tree was within reach. Up next was research. Science uses a great deal of resources, so I had to set up a bunch of assemblers for intermediate products, like gears and electric circuits. These are important both for science and for creating a central hub to collect materials later. Usually this is called a mall, but it felt way too lacking for that. Then I headed down to grab some more iron. Building was actually starting to feel pretty quick. It wasn't, at all, but it does seem more natural. After a bit of a hassle, I had 3/4 of a smelting lane. Good enough, but it would have been better if I hadn't planned for steel furnaces and just had, a full smelting lane. Finishing the mall was pretty straightforward after that, but I forgot to leave room to reach the mall easily, and yeah, easy access was kind of the whole point, so I definitely missed the mark there. The spaghetti was really starting to pile up by this point, and my attempts at an interchange and belt loop combo to get around the base were disrupted by my terrible planning, but I pushed onward. Science is just around the corner, a few more assembly machines here, a long stretch of labs there, and ta-da! Red and green smoothies. Tasty, tasty smoothies. With science set up, I grabbed steel axe to mine belts faster, fixed them all a bit, and then took my first major pivot from a standard playthrough. Fast transport belts. Usually I go for better automation or steel furnaces to speed up production, but nope. I wanted the red belt. These belts double belt throughput, which is great for upgrading the factory, but they also work on the player. My movement speed was about to double. In theory, at least. It will speed up straight stretches substantially, but churns are still tricky to outbuild. I had to wait for research before getting to anything new, so it was a good time for base upgrades. I needed more of pretty much every resource, but first, I had to optimize my rotations. Up until now, I had been using offshore pumps, Q-picks of nearby items, or the set of cardinal directions I made out of refineries. I didn't place refineries very often, or ever by this point, but the large hitbox made it very easy to Q-pick. It worked fine, but since they're just generic rotations, I still had to select an item afterwards. Because this got a bit tedious, it made sense to make a dedicated compass for the common entities like inserters and belts, especially for getting around the base, so this really did help a lot. Having a blueprint of it easily accessible on my hotbar was so nice when I had to do something new, and honestly, I should have set this up way earlier. Now that rotations were smooth, it was time to prepare for oil. That means the factory must grow. For spacing purposes, I expanded copper first, but I can't believe I got this far without even half a lane. I mean, look how sparse this is. It should be thick with resources. Like that iron. Oh baby, that belt is thick. After copper was done, I made a compact version of the steel lane where you direct feed iron between the furnaces. It's more rotations, but the narrow design made it way easier to reach everything, so it seemed worth it. And then we'll just have to do it all again on the other side, so I probably should have been building through the middle. With smelting done, copper and iron drills needed an expansion as well, and I was starting to get pretty good at placing them. It was just a matter of finding a belt that was already placed and riding along it, holding left click. Okay, fine, this part wasn't hard. Oh, power probably needed an upgrade too, considering it was barely 10% of its max size, and it went way better this time. I actually brought iron, it wasn't smelted, so I tossed it in a furnace and built the coal drills while it finished. Then I went back to finishing the power plant now that I had the iron for pipes. Still wanting to delay that dreaded trip to oil, I set up the framework for blue science next. First up was green chips, where I realized that I could use splitters to move the player, but was a bit disappointed to find it didn't randomly choose a lane to send the player, or, split the player in half. But what can you do? These chips used a similar layout to the previous intermediate build, except it had a couple copper cable assemblers at the end. I couldn't comfortably reach both sides from where I was standing, and I had to go around, which took a while if you can't tell by the day change. The cables and green chips go into these advanced circuit assemblers, which can easily be built with sets of long inserters, which is really nice since I didn't have to pull out the compass that much. Blue science was basically the same, but with longer sets of inserters and an extra assembler row. This is always one of my favorite builds in the game because there's just something so satisfying about dragging 5 inserters in a row. It's even more satisfying when you can do it quickly. Once blue science was built, I accidentally deadlocked the red chips and continued building without noticing it. It was nice to have the return belt in the correct direction though. It meant I didn't have to flip the belts as I finished the lane. I also realized I still needed pipes for oil, so I crammed a conveniently out of place, not so convenient pipe assembler next to green chips, which was really hard to get to. Then I finished setting blue science through the map view. There was still one more thing I could do to delay oil, a small brick lane for refineries. It was a bit messy due to the small stone patch and lack of drills that I stole from elsewhere, but I managed and... I guess I can't delay oil anymore, can I? Fine, let's get it over with. Honestly, it really wasn't far, and pipes don't have a direction, so after a long crawl to crude oil, I just placed pump jacks in whichever direction they wanted to be in, and followed it up with a beautiful pipe creation. Perfect. It wouldn't be Factorio without some pipe art. One belt creep back and... oh. I could only afford one refinery, but that's enough to start. Now to just steal coal from the furnace lanes, set up the plastic, and drag it with me on my way to sulfur. Sulfur was a bit trickier since it needed both water and petroleum gas. In other words, it needs 2 pipes going randomly through my base. This usually wasn't a big deal, but I had to leave these large gaps as travel lanes, so instead I cut through some resources and headed back down to finish refineries. And ta-da! We finally have petroleum, 4 hours into the run. Now that the fluids were all hooked up, it was only a matter of time until bots. Now that blue was mostly working, it's still a bit backed up from that deadlock, and I still need to set up batteries, lube, frames, and electric engines, but yeah, I basically have bots. I started with batteries since I was near sulfur, so I had to finagle a sulfuric acid plant into this little cranny, took some plates using the most unnecessary side loader ever, then stole some copper only to realize it was really low. But hey, at least I got to use steel furnaces for the first time. Super easy upgrade, but I still wish I hadn't used them at all. While I'm down here, I might as well get sidetracked by advanced oil, and I inch my way back towards the refineries. To avoid some headache, I plopped down a few storage tanks for each output, which I realized I can't rotate them after I place them, so that took a bit to fix. The goal here was to just launch a rocket, which you can easily do with just a few tanks. You don't need to deal with all the tricky byproducts. Connecting the advanced oil refineries was pretty alright. If you double click with underground pipes, it will flip them, so I basically had an easy rotate button for the first time, so long as everything was going the same direction. Just a few more tanks to go, which I definitely did not get stuck in. Sure was starting to wish I had that lube now. Situations like this actually happened a lot. If you get pushed off a belt before rotating it, you get stuck against other entities, and the only fix is to delete it. So after a daring escape, I headed back to the batteries, stole some resources for them because who needs science to run, and set up a couple battery assemblers. Well, chem plants. So with batteries done, there are only a couple more components for bots, which fit quite nicely next to blue science. There's only one minor hurdle here. Fluid assembly machines always have the output default to the north side, so no rotation tricks work on it. There was a simple workaround by leaving a gap between each machine. It wasn't the prettiest, but it did the job. If I were expecting this, a horizontal design would have worked as well, but oh well. Too late now. The rest of the build went by with no other hitches, just slowly ride the belts while placing everything that faces the same direction. You know the drill. I even hoarded some electric engines for exoskeletons. Gotta increase that movement speed, right? I kid. It's for the rocket silo. The engines craft slowly, so it's really nice to set them up early so you don't have to worry about them. So there's really only a couple more belts to go, and there we have it. Bots. So what now? Is the run basically over? Well, not exactly. A big reason I went with mouse only and not just no walking was to affect the whole run, even the bot phase. Sure, I don't need to move around as much, but using bots is still a bit tricky without access to most hotkeys, especially since I'm not allowing imported blueprints. While building them all, I discovered one super helpful trick: downgrading blue belts. You see, if you have an item in your inventory, it's difficult to ghost it for bots to place without a keyboard. Normally you'd shift click, but I can't do that. So instead, I used advanced belts that I knew I would never have and used an upgrade planner to downgrade them to normal belts. It was either this or constantly clearing my inventory of travel belts, so it was a great trick to have up my sleeves. Couldn't justify an actual trip to upgrade them all in person, so I just set the recipes remotely using the copy and paste functions over map view. Yeah, these upgrades were super awkward. Bots were not GG. With them all improved and base expansions planned, I needed some more upgrades. This included some smelters, which took a lot of attempts to set them up. Losing the force build button makes quick manipulation so much more awkward. Wide open spaces also avoid this, but the coal belts and these power poles blocked all the good spots, so I was stubborn. Then I ran into the classic milk and cookies problem. If you give an engineer some furnaces, he'll ask for some more miners. Then he'll ask for a poorly connected power plant, and then he'll ask for even more smelters. Like, a lot of smelters. Maybe too many smelters? We're not on good pace for a launch, so we really don't need this many. And of course, too many smelters meant I needed too many miners, so I had to add those as well. I wasn't counting, but I'm sure this was enough. Connecting miners to the new smelters was a breeze thanks to Smart Belt. Well, so long as my inventory was clear. It helped that I did the belts in very long stretches and then turned multiple belts at a time to reduce rotations. By this point, most of the smelters had finished building and my coal supply was really crashing. The fix was as easy as pasting a new coal lane and drawing a perfectly straight line back to the furnace lane. Finally, a task that wasn't any harder without a keyboard, and it only took 6 hours to find one. For a new large red chip build, I just picked an empty space to start chopping up my old design, and oh god, why is that blinking? Oh god, no, that's bad. Power was plummeting, and without a radar vision, it needed some manual intervention, so one leisurely stroll later, I made it to power, and added a missing coal lane. Sure, I missed other critical things like, I don't know, water, but at least I have coal, which I also missed, so I guess problem solved? I'm sure it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. I'm sure I'll notice eventually. For now, I just went back to chopping up the chip build and used a convenient coal patch for locally sourced plastic. The final chip on my shoulder was processing units. These also have that north-only fluid input, which I had already forgotten about because, in my defense, it had been a week since I last played, but that's okay. Compact builds are for people with keyboards and apparently good memories, so I just left another gap instead. Just like the gap in my memory. These bad boys practically share a recipe with modules, so I can just throw them next to each other and call it good. The ratios were definitely off, but I figured some patience and a bunch of buffer chests would suffice. I mean, the run's not going to be fast anyway. After all that chip hassle, Lotus Destructure seemed fairly easy. It just needed a bit of plastic, some steel, and copper from those excess smelters we made. I started with an LDS assembler on each half, copied it up a bunch of times, and there we have it. Easy peasy, though I do wish I had placed it 3 tiles to the left to avoid the Roboport. Now, onto the final tier of sciences. But first, I added productivity modules to the labs, which required me to deconstruct and reconstruct them, which was a bit messy, but it worked. Stack transferring and walking would have been way nicer here, because that's usually what you do. With prods and labs, I moved on to the higher tier sciences. These sciences are pretty simple if you've already set up their components. It's hard to run a lot of them, but getting enough to just launch a rocket is easy. They also benefit greatly from prods. Building both sciences simultaneously helps a lot since they have a very similar footprint, so I get the yellow half set up, which relies entirely on buffered resources, and then move on to purple, which eats through the buffers like crazy, so we'll probably need even more resources, especially steel. No matter what you do, you never have enough steel for purple. Although it didn't help that I built way more purple than I can afford to run. I had like 2 steel smelters. Why did I think I can run this? Whatever. Assemblers are cheap. After pretending I had enough steel to run this, I connected the buffers through a quick stick lane in the middle of my base, and voila! Science! In 10 minutes, once everything is finally built. Since the run was ending soon, I hand-fed a small amount of RoboFrames to Yellow Science instead of connecting a belt. I only need like 1,300 Yellow Science anyway, so it didn't matter that it wasn't sustainable. It did take a while to shuttle the frames over, but it was definitely worth it to avoid wasting precious rocket parts. Now with Science up and running, there were only a few small tasks to complete before launch, including Prod 2s, which have a perfect spot right near the buffers. These get churned to tier 3 modules later, which reduce the silo cost from 1,000 parts down to 720, which is huge. There is also some spare steel in the original base that I used to speed up Purple Science, which is great because Purple Science was hungry. I wasn't kidding when I said there's never enough steel. Up next was Concrete, one of the easier and most forgettable components of the rocket. It's much more useful in runs where you can, walk and use it for the movement speed bonus. But hey, we remembered it this time. Concrete just needs some bricks, a bit of iron, and some water pipes. Yeah, some. I think that'll connect. It was also about time to swap module production over to speeds. I only needed about 1,000 of each to launch a rocket, so it was easier to just repurpose the assemblers, especially since they were basically already done. The last big thing for launch was rocket control units. These relied on buffered resources, and aside from this really weird side swapper I did to avoid rotating 2 belts, it was pretty easy to set up. Plus, I could pretend I had way more resources than I actually had by pasting 60 plus assemblers. I even got to use the blue belt trick again since I picked up some trash along the way. And that's the last of it. I definitely wasn't missing one rocket component that I always forget about that's even more forgettable than concrete, but that's fine. Rocket fuel should build fast enough. I didn't build it fast, but once built, it produced pretty fast. Just gotta find some random nook to set it up instead of some wide open space next to it, because why wouldn't I make it harder on myself? While waiting for rocket fuel, I also had this realization that if I were to die before bots, I would be soft locked unless I happen to have some belts or fuel or something over by the spawn. Fortunately, the risk of death was pretty low thanks to the peaceful world, but it definitely was something to keep in mind in case I revisit this later. The only thing left while waiting for rocket fuel was to take a nice leisurely stroll through the base to collect the remaining rocket silo parts. I already had steel and pipes, so I just needed concrete, the electric engines from earlier, and blue chips, which I was right next to, but while looking at the map to expand rocket fuel, my belt loop pushed me all the way to the other side of the base. Took a couple minutes to get back, but I did make it eventually. And with all those resources gathered, it was just a matter of crafting the silo and making my way back to the rocket components. It was pretty poetic that I ran out of belt and had to do the original belt shuffle all the way back. I had also promised chat some bacon, so I reluctantly placed a couple of them to speed up the launch and asked if there were any ideas for cargo. And yeah, somebody suggested I launch my dreams, but those are gone by now. But that's it. That's Factorio with only a mouse, using entirely default keybinds. It's surprisingly not as bad as I thought it would be. Queue picking really carried the run. I'm even thinking of trying it again with default map gen, and yes, that means biters, now that I know all the rotation tricks. If you enjoyed and want to see more, I stream dumb stuff like this on Twitch most Mondays. I will also be uploading them here and to the VODs channel, so be sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss them. If you have an idea you want to see me attempt, feel free to drop a suggestion below. Thanks so much for watching. Peace!